The term logic is derived from the ancient Greek word logos. Logos may be translated in two principal ways. The first is as a word, as in a spoken thought. For example, if your friend asked you how you were and you replied that you were happy, your response, "I am happy," would be an example of a logos. There smiling on the picture is Rembrandt's depiction of Democritus, nicknamed the laughing philosopher. Logos may also be translated as proportion, as in one of those in arithmetic or geometry, the study of number and the study of shape, respectively. For an example of this, Socrates, in Plato's Republic, once asked Glaucon to imagine dividing a line into two unequal parts, and then to imagine dividing both these unequal parts in the same unequal proportion as before. For example, if a 10-foot red line, which you see there on the left, was divided into two unequal parts, there in the green below, one 3 feet on the left and one 7 feet on the right, these two green parts would then be divided again in the same unequal proportion as the red line originally was as well. So you see the two green segments on the right now, and each of these segments is now broken in the same 3 and 7 proportion, resulting in the 4 blue lines you see at the bottom right of the slide. Socrates calls a proportion such as this a logos. In the discipline of philosophy, logic is a sub-discipline that, in part, identifies valid arguments, that is, those in which the conclusion necessarily follows from the given premises. This sub-discipline of logic is usually credited to Aristotle, who formulated the syllogism. The syllogism in its basic form is as follows. Premise 1. A is X. Premise 2. All X is Y. These are the two given premises. The underlining beneath the second premise indicates that all premises have been given, and that what follows below the underlining in the bold is the conclusion purported to necessarily follow from these given premises. A is Y. Take a moment to think about this, how it is self-evident that if A is X and all X is Y, A is Y. For an example, here is one of the most famous syllogisms which will usually be presented in philosophy textbooks where syllogisms are covered. Premise 1. Socrates is a man. Premise 2. All men are mortal. The conclusion in bold. Socrates is mortal. Note how, given the premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. According to premise 1, Socrates is a man, and premise 2 indicates that all men have a certain quality, and therefore Socrates, being a man, must necessarily have this quality as well. This syllogism, this argument, is declared valid in that the conclusion follows from its premises. Notice the green arrow pointing downwards, which will be our symbol indicating that a syllogism is valid. Another example of a syllogism in the same form, this time involving Plato. Again, Raphael's depiction on the left. Premise 1. Plato is an Athenian. Premise 2. All Athenians are Greek. The conclusion, Plato is Greek. Note that this syllogism again follows the basic form of the syllogism as previously noted. A is X, all X is Y. A is Y, as you see at the bottom of the screen in the italics. Again, the two green arrows demonstrate that each of these syllogisms is valid. The conclusion necessarily follows from the two given premises. Here is another example of a valid argument, a valid syllogism, this time concerning Aristotle, again depicted by Raphael on the right of the slide. Premise 1, Aristotle was a student of Plato. Premise 2, all students of Plato studied shape. The conclusion in bold, Aristotle studied shape. This is a valid argument. The conclusion necessarily follows that if Aristotle was a student of Plato, and if all the students of Plato studied a certain topic, then Aristotle, being a student of Plato, must have studied that topic. The argument is valid, hence the green arrow pointing downwards. Having covered the prior three examples of valid syllogisms, we should stop and take a moment to mention that validity is different than truth. The point of the syllogism is not to show what in fact is true. Rather, the point of a syllogism is to show what necessarily follows given premises. As an example of this, we will return to the syllogism involving Socrates, but we'll change the quality from mortal into immortal. You see the first premise is the same as before. Socrates is a man. Premise 2 is different. All men are immortal. The conclusion in bold, Socrates is immortal. Notice the green arrow pointing downwards again. This indicates that the syllogism is valid. Given the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows, even though the conclusion is in fact false. Depicted very well on the right, as this is a scene from Socrates' execution. Here is another example, where the conclusion is in fact not true, but given the premises, the conclusion is valid. Premise 1, Plato is an Egyptian. Premise 2, all Egyptians are Africans. Conclusion in bold, Plato is African. Again, given the two premises, the conclusion is valid. You see the green arrow on the right, even though the conclusion is not true. Here is another example. Premise 1, Aristotle was a disciple of Thales. Premise 2, all disciples of Thales were materialists. The conclusion in bold, Aristotle was a materialist. The first premise is in fact false. Aristotle was not a disciple of Thales. Even though the second premise is true, all disciples of Thales were materialists, Thales himself being one. The conclusion is not true. Aristotle was not a materialist. But, given the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. Let us take a moment to review what we have covered in this presentation. Remember that the term logic is derived from the ancient Greek word logos, that Aristotle is credited as being the father of logic by his formulation of the syllogism. Remember that a syllogism in basic form consists of two premises and one valid conclusion necessarily following from them. And very important to remember, validity and truth are two different concepts. A conclusion is valid if the conclusion necessarily follows the given premises. but a valid conclusion may in fact be false. This has been an introduction to logic.